All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to this afternoon's research seminar sponsored by the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy and the SAIS Energy Resources and Environment Program. I am very happy to introduce Abhishek Jain from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. He's based in Delhi and he's a senior program lead for the Energy Access Program. I advertised this seminar by noting that there are very few people in the world who know as much about Indian energy access as Abhishek does. We've been working together for the past 5 years, done extensive research with his team. So I'm very excited to myself to hear the latest thoughts on what's happening in India, what are the key energy access challenges, and where the field is moving. We're going to follow our usual strategy. So Abhishek is going to first give us a presentation about 30 to 40 minutes. After that, we're going to open it for discussion. And then at the end of the talk, we will have a small reception. Sorry, live stream people, this is not available to you in room 204 next door.
202.
202, okay. We're going to be in room 202. So Abhishek, why don't you walk us through the latest findings and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Thank you, Hannes. Thank you for the introduction as well as for hosting me for the talk here. As Johannes mentioned, I come from the organization called Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We are an independent, not-for-profit policy research think tank based out of New Delhi. Let's see if the lights are okay. Should we switch off the light? Because I think there are some slides which are going to be a little darker. Yeah, like that. Okay. So a little bit of background for those who are not familiar with the organization. It's an independent, not-for-profit policy research think tank based in New Delhi. We are about 9 years old. We started in 2010. We are about a 50-member strong team, mostly researchers with different expertise. There are folks with engineering backgrounds, economics, social sciences, political science, and so on and so forth. There are different bunch of areas that we focus on as organization and call them our focus areas. There are about 8 of those. I lead the energy access work at the council, but in addition we work on large-scale renewables, particularly looking at the markets as well as financing of large-scale renewables, looking at power sector, the traditional power sector reforms as well as the new market dynamics because of the technologies which are emerging every now and then, decentralized renewables, storage, and so on and so forth. Then we also look at industrial sustainability and emissions as well as competitiveness within industry. Energy efficiency is one main focus here. We also do a lot of long-term pathway modeling around carbon emissions across the sectors, across different demand sectors in the economy. There's quite a bit of work happening on the risk and adaptation, both risks from the local environmental issues like air pollution, as well as global environmental issues like climate change. So a lot of work on heat stress is another. Then we do some work around what we call over-the-horizon technologies in a focus area called technology, trade and finance. So things like hydrogen economy, things like climate geoengineering governance, like technologies which are not available today at the commercial level, but if happens will have a radical impact on national as well as global economy. And finally, and this is the latest addition into our focus areas, we have set up a center for energy finance, sort of an offshoot from our renewables finance work, because we are realizing in the energy transition where more and more energy is coming through capital intensive technologies rather than operationally intensive technologies. Cost of finance becomes a very critical influencer in terms of what the cost of energy is going to be. Okay, moving on. The title of the talk was Inside India's Energy Access Revolution. And I just sort of wanted to set the context that why it is a revolution. So between over the last 18 months, and more precisely between October 2017 and December 2018, over that specific period of 15 months, India electrified about 50,000 households on average every single day. Now that's like simply saying that we electrified population of Australia 5 times over in a matter of 15 months. Now the pace and the scale of such an effort is unprecedented globally. Having said that, it does come with the years of foundational work which has happened before this 15-month of activity. India is a pretty vast country in terms of its geography span. There are close to 600,000 villages in India. Before the implementation of this program, which is termed as Sobhagya, which in Hindi means good luck. Basically, it's in English it means good luck. The actual foundational work for expanding the electricity network to each and every household in the country happened over the last decade or so. Back in 2005, there was a scheme of the government called Rajiv Gandhi Gramin Vidyutikaran Yojana, which was sort of the flagship scheme to put together the rural electrification infrastructure. And that scheme led to enabling expansion of the grid infrastructure to almost every village of the country. But that did not mean that every household was connected. Given that the geographical span of a village itself can be significant, there are different communities living in villages called hamlets and habitation and so on, does mean that even though the infrastructure was reaching to the central larger communities of the village, it was not covering each and every household. And the way electrification definition was being used in India, the rural electrification definition, even if the 10% of the households in a particular village had electricity connection, the village was deemed as electrified. That's why you heard a news sometime in April last year that India announced 100% village electrification. And then there was another news towards the end of this year that India had reached 100% household electrification for 25 of its states. So it actually creates a lot of confusion for those who do not really follow very closely, like how does these definitions play out, like what does village electrification mean vis-a-vis household electrification and so on. So I just wanted to sort of set the context on electrification front through that one number. And here's another number which is on the second important energy that a household experience or a household use, which is towards the cooking energy. In fact, if you look at most of the developing countries, a larger share of household energy in terms of kilojoules or kilocalories actually go towards cooking energy than towards electricity. And here we have an even more fascinating story. So over the last 3 years, starting from May 2016 till as late as March 2019, India had provided 70 million LPG connections to low-income households. Now, just to contextualize this number, this is 5 times the UK population. And providing these many connections over the 3 years actually means releasing 70,000 new LPG connections every single day, including holidays and Sundays. Again, the scale and the pace at which this has happened is simply unprecedented, not just in India but globally. And this particular effort also led to many more connections coming up over the last 3 years. I'm just talking about 70 million connections under one particular scheme of the government, which was to provide almost free of cost connections to low-income households. But as the LPG infrastructure expanded because of the expansion, or because of provision of LPG connections to low-income households, even many well-to-do or middle-income households also started enrolling into LPG program. So overall, India has actually added about 100 million connections over the last 3.5 years. Now, having looked at these two pretty dramatic in terms of its pace and scale developments which have happened over the last few years in India, the big question that is, like, is energy access just about connections? Because both of these schemes, which are fairly the flagship schemes of the current government, which is we are now about to go into elections in a month or so, and these two schemes have been a big part of government's campaign and otherwise. Like, is energy access just about connections? Because both of these schemes target the fundamental challenge of providing energy access through the traditional approaches of centralized grid and through LPG access. And those of you who are familiar with energy access debate or have been following it over the years would be able to sort of concur with me here that there are many nuances to the energy access problem. Energy access is not just a binary yes or no whether you have a connection or not. It's about how costly it is to actually afford that energy. We still see energy poor in developed world. I mean, US has energy poor, UK has energy poor. About 10 million population across the Europe is deemed as energy poor. Not because they do not have a connection, not because they do not have reliable supply, but because they are not able to afford the basic energy for their basic consumption. So affordability, for example, is one dimension which actually plays out pretty strongly when we talk about energy access. Similarly, there is another dimension, and this is in the context of electricity, the duration of supply, the availability of supply, whether the supply is available reliably or not. Because these things, even though do not have an explicit value in our electricity tariffs, each one of us do implicitly value them as important characteristics or attributes of energy access. Anyone here who has experienced power cuts in their lifetime? Okay. Almost a full room with hands up. But this is a reality which most of the developing countries face every now and then, multiple times a day. So a lot of them cope up by putting in what we call, very common in South Asia, called inverters. So you put a storage system in your home where you have the electricity getting stored in a local battery in your household, and you use that energy or use that electricity when there is a power cut. So every household ends up investing, particularly the urban household, end up investing in these small assets. And why do they invest? Because there is an intrinsic value to the reliability that you get. I just wanted to sort of explicitly bring out that point. Another dimension which is very important in terms of the supply situation or the energy access debate or discourse that we talk about is the service quality. And service quality not just limited to how reliable your supply is, how much available the energy is as and when you need, for example, an LPG cylinder, how soon can you get it once you have booked it, and so on. But also in terms of how well your meters are being read, how reflective is your bill that you're receiving every month vis-a-vis the actual consumption that you're having. And mind you that we are talking about fairly remote communities. And we're talking about situations where smart meters are not yet available globally or universally. So you're literally relying on linemen or the meter readers going a few kilometers every month and covering a whole bunch of villages to actually read each and every meter to generate accurate bills. So this in itself is a task, and we'll delve into it as we go further into the talk. But these are by no means the exhaustive dimensions of energy access. These are some of the aspects I just wanted to touch or highlight to give you a flavor of how energy access is a much more complex situation than what we usually think of. And all this led to the genesis of a work which happened, as Jonas said, which started happening about 5 years ago. And we term it as ACCESS. It's an acronym which stands for Access to Clean Cooking Energy and Electricity Survey of States. There were two primary reasons why we did ACCESS. One was the whole issue that I'm talking about, like the multidimensionality of energy access. Energy access is neither a unidimensional issue nor a binary yes or no. There are different levels of energy access that a household or an end user can experience. But more importantly, and going back to the definition of rural electrification in India, depending upon what you define as your energy access, that becomes your target and that becomes your goal that you try to achieve through policy or through the implementation of the policy. While the initial target was rural electrification, that's what everyone was focused on up until 2015, 2016, that let's just bring the infrastructure to every nook and corner, irrespective of whether that infrastructure is actually delivering the end service that a household cares about. Then the goalpost shifted to household electrification. So instead of just having the infrastructure at the village level, the debate moved on to actually connecting every household to that grid. Again, not realizing whether that connection now at the household level is realizing the actual energy benefits or not. And that's why it is important that we move the debate or move the discourse to an era where we talk about multidimensional energy access, where we explicitly value each of these dimensions of energy access so that the policymakers, the bureaucrat, the administration, the service providers, and the consumer realize that what does it mean to have energy access for the eventual social and economic development. And the second reason why we did this massive effort of doing a large-scale primary survey in India, I'll talk more about it in a minute or so, was essentially around data gap. If you have objectives which are at a very broader level that, okay, you want to expand electricity infrastructure in every nook and corner, you're not actually bothered about how much are the hours of supply at the household level. You're not bothered about whether the households are getting adequate voltage quality or not. You're not bothered about how many of those connections are actually legal or illegal. All these dimensions, we were not able to find any data whatsoever, even if we wanted to paint a realistic picture of energy access in India. And that's why we had to undertake a primary survey ourselves to really understand what is the situation on the ground when it comes to some of these challenges. And this was the report which came out back in 2015. The first survey that we did across 6 large states in India. And I'm going to quickly show you what are the states so that you get a little more familiar with the geography that we are talking about. So back in 2015, we did the first ever multidimensional energy access survey conducted in India. We reached out to about 8,600 households in 6 of the significantly large states in India, which together covers about 40% of Indian population. So you can imagine that we are talking about close to 500 million people across these 6 states. So it's a fairly large area that was covered. We spoke to about 8,600 households across more than 700 villages in these 6 states, covering about 51 districts. But more interestingly, in last summer, we actually went back to these households after a gap of about 3.5 years, making it the largest panel data on energy access, looking at energy access from a multidimensional perspective. So we actually tracked how these households have fared over the years, whether the situation has changed, if at all, and if the situation has changed, how their attitudes around their energy access have also evolved along with this. So I'm quickly going to talk about the framework that we used as a sort of underlying way to capture the multidimensionality of energy access. And those of you who are familiar with World Bank, ISEP, multi-tier framework might be able to see some significant similarities here. This framework was developed back in 2014-15 when the MTF framework of World Bank itself was in its infancy and was sort of evolving. So it is strongly inspired from that framework, but is adapted to Indian context as we deemed fit back then. So I just wanted to focus on the top row and the first column for now. Essentially, the column represent all the different dimensions that we were talking about. The capacity of electricity connection, which means that how much of different appliances can you run given your particular connection. Let's say if you have a solar home system, can you run a fridge on it? Can you run a water pump on it? Or can you just run a lighting solution along with maybe, let's say, fans and a television? So depending upon how much load can you run, that's what capacity is. Duration of supply is pretty clear, how many hours in a day you're getting the supply for electricity. Reliability, the way we define reliability is in terms of 24-hour long blackouts in a month. Number of 24-hour long blackouts in a month. And why we use such a crude metric of reliability? I mean, in developed world, we have reliability typically going into microseconds, if not, or milliseconds, if not microseconds. Whereas in the developing world context, we are talking about reliability for as long as a day worth of unscheduled outage. And why so? Because we're particularly trying to look at the maintenance challenges which this particular dimension uncovers. For example, if you see, let's say, a daily supply of 8 to 12 hours or even 16 hours, and you know that there is a load shedding happening almost on a daily basis, which means that this is an intentional load shedding which is done by the distribution companies to manage their peak demand and so on, because rural consumers are typically the least revenue generating consumers for any distribution company. So you are actually the most better off to shave off the load from the rural consumer side than from anyone else. So duration of supply is more a sort of reflection of the load shedding which happens intentionally. Whereas reliability is more a reflection of the maintenance services that the electricity utility provides in the event of a default or a fault or a issue in the system itself. Let's say a distribution transformer is defunct, and how long will it take to get that rectified in a rural area is usually will get reflected in such a response, whether it takes 24 hours, 48 hours, 2 days, 5 days, and so on and so forth. And it is not so unusual to come across rural households who will say that we have not received a supply for last week or so. So this is reflective of the maintenance issues. And why we sort of break them down into different issues is also to help the administrators, help those who are actually making these decisions and providing these services, able to identify where the problem lies. Unless you are able to delineate the problem, it is very difficult to actually have a targeted action to improve the situation. The second thing which I want you to focus on is the top row, which essentially means that across each of these dimensions, we try to place households based on their situation across different tiers, or you can consider them as different steps of ladders. Where tier 3 is whatever, the best in class one can receive, which means almost 24 hours of supply, no day-long blackouts, no issues with regards to the quality of supply, no instances where your voltage was low or where your voltage was so high that your equipment got damaged. The energy is affordable to you, it is a legal connection, and so on. And similarly, the situation sort of worsens as you move down the tier, and so on. So I won't go into each and every block here, but I hope the idea is clear that the way we are trying to define different dimensions, and across different dimensions, we're trying to define different tiers which a household can achieve. One important bit is that once you fill this metrics for any one particular end user or a household, you try to look at what is the minimum tier that the household has achieved across all of these dimensions. And that minimum tier becomes the overall tier for that household on, in this case, electricity access front. And a question may be that why we want it to be a minimum and not an average, and so on and so forth. The reason why we use a conservative estimate is to actually identify what are the bottlenecks, what are the pain points that one needs to focus on. If let's say a household is on tier 3 on capacity, is on tier 2 on duration of supply, but is on tier 1 on reliability, and is probably on higher tiers on other two, I know that it is the reliability that I need to focus on in order to pull that household from a poorer experience of energy access to a richer experience of energy access. So that's how this framework works. There can be multiple bottlenecks for a household, there can be just one, and so on and so forth. A similar framework is used for cooking energy, where we look at dimensions like health and safety, which is primarily vetted through the primary cooking source of the household, whether they are using a clean cooking fuel with respect to indoor air pollution, or whether they are using traditional biomass, could be firewood, could be dung cake, and so on. Next, we look at the availability of cooking fuel, to what extent the household is satisfied with the availability of their primary cooking fuel. We also look at the quality of cooking, whether the arrangement that the household is using is able to give them the adequate quality of cooking or not. We look at the affordability of cooking, in terms of whether the cooking energy is affordable for the households or not. And we also look at the convenience of cooking, how difficult or easy it is for the households to use that particular solution. Now, moving on to some of the results. Here is a headline result, like about 118 million rural population, these are not households, this is now the population number I'm talking about, has moved out of absolute energy poverty across these 6 states over the last 3 years. And if you look at some of the more familiar metrics to look at rural electrification, the population which was connected to grid back in 2015 was about 64%, which moved to 84% when we did the survey. And now I can say with a decent degree of confidence that this number is close to anywhere between 95 to 100%, because there has been since July when the survey was done, there is a lot more further work which has happened across these states. But a more important metric is like beyond connection, like how many of households were actually using electricity as the primary source of lighting. And this number has actually improved much more dramatically than the connection number. Back in 2015, there were only about 40% of households who were using electricity as primary source of lighting. So you can see the gap, like 64% households were connected, but only 42% were able to use electricity for as basic service of electricity as lighting, because of the challenges in terms of duration of supply, in terms of reliability, and so on. But now you can see that gap closing down a bit. 84% connections translating to about 74% households using it as a primary source of lighting. I guess there is some issue with the value here. But in terms of the multi-tier framework, we see now more than 50% households who are actually receiving energy supply on a multi-tier, multi-dimensional basis of electricity access. And if you look at how the tiers are spread between 2015 and 2018, you see that a large chunk which was in tier 0, almost 2/3 of the population which was in tier 0 back in 2015, a good chunk has now moved towards the higher tier, but still majority of them are limited to only tier 1 level of quality. We have seen some improvement in tier 2 and tier 3, but even today only about 20% of the rural households across the 6 states are enjoying services which are of higher quality. And if you look at sort of a geographical spread, even though the disparity among the states have come down, the worst of states have actually improved more than, let's say, the relatively better of states. As you can see from the shades here on the graphs, the lighter, basically the way to read this graph is the lighter are the worst and the darker are the better. So you can see like a lot of lighter regions back in 2015, whereas in 2018 you see many more regions across these 6 states sort of catching up and are slowly showing signs of improvement. Similarly, if you look at the same information across stat bars, you can see that there is a reduction in tier 1 households across the board, except in one state, which is West Bengal. And this is quite interesting because typically one would assume that, okay, over the time the situation is going to improve. But such a multidimensional analysis actually tells you that there are also chances for things to regress over time. And I also tried to dig a lot over the last few months that what is it that is making situation going worse off in a state which was actually the best in 2015, still remains the best in 2018, but compared to its own performance has actually worsened off over the last 3 years. And it turns out that the political economy of the power sector in the state has quite a significant role to play. There were a series of reforms which have happened between 2005 to 2011, which sort of also kept the momentum even between 2011 to 2015-16, but have started dwindling down because of the change of government back in 2011. Until 2011, the West Bengal had a particular party which was ruling the state for more than 27 years. But there was a change of government which led to a lot of short-termism coming in. Instead of long-term reforms in the various sectors, including energy, there were short-term populist reforms in terms of not passing through the tariff increases and so on, which slowly then started hurting the distribution companies and their performance dwindling over the years. Now the big question is, like, if 80% of the population is still stuck in tier 0 and tier 1, the two bottom tiers of electricity access, what are the reasons why they are stuck and what can we do in order to pull those households into the higher tiers? And as you can see, capacity quite understandably has come down as a bottleneck because many more new electricity connections have rolled out over the last few years, as we discussed. And I'm sure that this number is now much lower than 32. As I said, that connections have rolled out even further over the last few months. Duration of supply is not a bottleneck. At least 4 hours of supply households are getting. It's a very crude metric, just 4 hours of supply in 24 hours, but still at least that is not a bottleneck at tier 0. What is becoming more and more a challenge is the quality of supply. Voltage issues are coming in because you are adding more people onto your distribution network, whereas you're not doing adequate demand forecasting. If your procurement of energy as a distribution company is not in line to the demand that is going to be realized, this is a typical issue that one faces. And the second challenge why quality becomes a challenge, quality surfaces out as a challenge, is that poor planning of the electricity infrastructure. If you typically consider like what should be the length of a 33 kilowatt line, 11 kilowatt line, or a 440 volt electricity line, Indian utilities will typically fare pretty poor in terms of how extensive they will extend a particular line without realizing that you're going to see a significant voltage drop as you keep on extending a particular line which is at a low voltage. So instead of using 11 kV at a particular instance, they will use 440 kV and so on. So that's another, poor planning is another reason why you see a lot of voltage issues. Looking at what are the challenges which are limiting households at tier 1, reliability is a big one, which means the maintenance issues need to be focused on a lot more. And another big one is affordability. And affordability actually plays out differently than how the metrics here are suggesting. It plays out in the sense that a lot of the households do not receive bills for a fairly long time. Typically for months you will not receive a bill, and then all of a sudden you will receive a bill which include all the backlog of last 8 months, 10 months, 12 months at times. Now that quantity then becomes such a significant one for households to pay that it at times lead to disconnections as well. So it's also a sort of cash flow issue which plays in when we talk about affordability. In terms of the more standard metrics, like how the duration of supply has fared over the years, again, the way to read this graph is the darker is better. So you can see across the board, the colors are tending towards dark between 2015 to 2018, except with an exception of Jharkhand, where a whole lot has not improved. There is some improvement, but not a whole lot. So you can see that different states fare very differently across these metrics. Now moving on to from supply to the revenue generation side. So for a utility, typically there are two things, like how well you are providing the service into the customer area, and how much revenue you are able to collect as a result of those services that you are providing. And what plays out in most of the developing world, including in India, it's a sort of negative reinforcing loop. You are not receiving as much revenue, so you always the rural customer is always at the least priority of the distribution companies. If you have to do the load shedding, these will be the first customers where you will see a load shedding happening. Maintenance constantly remains a challenge because it is much more costly to maintain infrastructure in rural area compared to in urban areas because of density of the customers. So what happens is that you have poor supply, which leads to poor satisfaction or poor willingness for the households to pay for that supply. That leads to further poor revenues for the DISCOM, leading to further poor supply. So it constantly becomes a negative reinforcing loop. And that's why it is important to understand like how some of the revenue generation happens across the rural areas. And one basic metric around revenue generation is whether a household is actually getting metered for the energy that they are consuming. And you can see what is the significant amount of variation across different states in terms of how many households actually have a meter, how many electrified households actually have a meter. And the situation is as poor as close to 20% households in Jharkhand to as good as almost 100% households in a state like West Bengal having meters. But just having a meter does not ensure that you will actually receive a bill which is reflective of your consumption, because someone has to read the meter and generate the bill. And there is a lot of gap in terms of generation of bills as well, even if you have meters. So here the green indicates the households which are having meter, proportion of households having meter. Blue indicates proportion of households not having meter. And this is 2018 data set. The darker shade basically indicate you are actually receiving a variable bill amount, which means that there is likelihood that the meter is getting read and you are actually receiving a bill which is reflective of your consumption. Whereas the middle shade of green indicates that you are a metered household, but you're still receiving a fixed bill, which means that meters are not being read and you're just getting a standard bill month after month. And then there are these lightest shades of metered households which are not receiving any bill at all. So these are basically the lost opportunities for DISCOMs to not generate revenue for the services that they are providing. And same interpretation for the blue shades here. Okay, moving on to the cooking energy side of the story. If about 120 million had gained or had moved out from the absolute electricity poverty, about 160 million have moved out of absolute cooking energy poverty. Okay, I'm not sure why. Okay, I'm sorry for the numbers here, but basically you'll be able to see like the extent of households which have moved from absolute tier 0 in cooking energy to higher tiers. But a whole lot of them still stuck at tier 1. And then we have about 20% households which are in tier 2 and tier 3. Similarly, you see a lot of variation geographically, just like in the case of electricity access. Improvements across the board, but you do see some spots of really poor performance. There are areas in Jharkhand, there are parts of Madhya Pradesh, and so on and so forth. Same thing on a stack bar. You can see improvements happening across the board. In some states, the improvements are much larger than the other. For example, in Bihar, you see a much radical improvement. In West Bengal, you see a significant improvement. So is in Uttar Pradesh, but not as much improvement in states like Jharkhand. And even though cooking energy, clean cooking energy access sort of includes 4 different fuel types. It can be electricity, it can be biogas, it can be LPG, it can be natural gas. Any gaseous fuel or electricity is considered clean from the indoor air pollution perspective. Whereas the Indian story around clean cooking energy, the way it has panned out over the last few years, is all about LPG. No other fuel has actually penetrated in any significant way. So clean cooking energy access in India is almost synonymous to LPG access. And here again, you can see a massive improvement in terms of the number of rural electricity connections across these 6 major states. But you also see many more households, rural households, using LPG as their primary fuel, as well as households using LPG as the exclusive fuel. Why it is so important to sort of track this metric is because even if you have an LPG connection, but you simultaneously use traditional biomass, a traditional cook stove, for some of your cooking, you're still exposing yourself to harmful indoor air pollution, which means that the public health benefit of the entire effort that the government is putting in doesn't get realized. And I was talking about a particular scheme of the government where 70 million connections were rolled out as we started the discussion. That scheme, which is called PMUY, Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, it's one of the flagship scheme of this government, actually led to a significant improvement in those connections, like the connection improvement that we saw. So all the connections that are coming in blue are actually attributed to that scheme. So you can see that more than 50% of the addition which has happened over the last 3 years is actually coming from this one particular scheme of the government. Another interesting aspect that this scheme led to was reducing the disparity among different social groups across the country. Caste system in India, I hope some of you who are familiar with Indian politics and Indian demography in general would be familiar with the caste system in India. There are different social groups which are also sort of recognized in the Constitution of India. And you can see that back in 2015, when this scheme was not around, there was a significant skew in terms of who is having an LPG connection and who is not having an LPG connection. And it was also sort of reflective of the purchasing capacity of these households, the incomes of these households, but also the access in terms of physical location, where the LPG distributors are, and so on and so forth. What has happened as part of this scheme, since the scheme was specifically targeting low-income households, including backward communities or social groups which are vulnerable, it had a specific focus on scheduled tribes as well as scheduled castes, which led to a significant improvement in number of LPG connections among these social groups. So this scheme has actually fared pretty nicely when we talk about the social equity aspect of any welfare scheme. But again, as we started the discussion, it is not just about providing the connection. If that connection is not leading to the use of the fuel in these households, we are not going to realize the public health benefit of the scheme. And one of the way to measure the use of the fuel is to actually look at the number of refills that the household is going to experience or going to get over the year for their LPG connection. So LPG in India is sort of distributed through cylinders, not in pipelines. So you have these 14.5 kg large cylinders which household refill every now and then as and when they need to refill them. And here are the numbers for the 2 different categories. Households which were the beneficiary of this particular scheme, which are in blue, and the green are those households who got the connection around the similar time when the beneficiaries got the connection, but were not part of the scheme, which means that they had to pay the upfront cost to get the LPG connection. And you can see a systematic difference in terms of the consumption of LPG among the 2 user groups. It's also pretty intuitive because more likely than not, the green ones are the households which are economically better off than the blue ones, because they were able to pay the upfront cost of getting in a connection. But at the same time, what turns out that even those who are paying to actually get a connection, sorry about the color confusion, here now I'm talking about the green households, though it shows blue. I'm talking about those who are not part of the scheme, who actually spent money to get a connection. it turns out that even their consumption is not they're not transitioning to LPG overnight. Their consumption to LPG also evolves over time, which means that the disuse of the traditional biomass happens over time. It's not a overnight phenomena that yes, tomorrow you have a LPG connection, from next day onwards you will not be using traditional biomass. So if even for the household, then mind you, the x-axis here is not number of months but number of years. So it is quite sticky in that sense. So even if it takes a lot of time for those who are paying for the connection to evolve their consumption, it will certainly take a longer time, if not this much, for the beneficiaries of a scheme who are getting a connection free of cost. So that's the sort of important point I wanted to highlight, that even though we see some refills happening, it is going to take a significantly longer time till these households actually transition, unless we do something proactively targeted around these households. Same question, like why so many households are in the the bottom two tiers on the cooking energy front. So the reason why a lot of the households are on tier 0, the biggest reason is that they do not have any access to any clean cooking energy. They're neither using electricity nor using any of the gaseous fuels for their cooking. That's the biggest reason why they are there. The another smaller but a very sort of critical reason from a social welfare perspective is there are about 14% households who were in tier 0 who said that availability of fuel is so bad that they are not able to cook as much as they would like to. So this has implications in terms of the nutrition intake that the households will have. When we sort of develop food security policies in the country, we rarely think of energy security as sort of a area which can influence the food security or the nutritional intake. In fact, to give you another example, there is a massive flagship scheme that the Indian government runs, and it has been a scheme which is now close to 2 decades old. It's called midday meal scheme in the government schools in India. This was a scheme which was started to sort of provide some incentive to rural households or rural children who are not getting nutritious meals to actually come to schools and also get 1 meal a day as sort of an incentive to coming to schools. And for a large amount of the time that this scheme has been rolled out, almost even after 10 years of the scheme actually got implemented, there was no budget in the scheme for the cooking energy for the meals to be prepared. There was budget month on month that how much grain you have to procure, how much vegetables you have to procure, and so on. But there was no budget line item allocated for the cooking energy to actually prepare the meals. So on tier 1, as you can see, affordability is a big challenge. And so is convenience, and this convenience is actually coming because a lot of these households who have got LPG connection are actually stacking their LPG along with traditional biomass. So they already are familiar with how convenient LPG can be, but their primary source of cooking is still traditional biomass. So they do report that it is not as convenient, and hence it is sort of reflecting as a challenge here. And by and large, even for the new connections to come into light, especially for those households who are not beneficiaries of this flagship scheme of the government, the upfront cost still remains a big barrier. Back in 2015, about 95% of the survey respondents mentioned it as a challenge, and now the number doesn't change even after 3 years, 92% suggests that. And similarly, the recurring cost of the fuel is a big barrier for many of the households to adopt LPG. And even when we ask the households who have an LPG connection that why are you not using it for most of your cooking, the biggest reason is affordability of the fuel month on month. Almost 92% of them say that they're not able to afford the fuel. And mind you that India has subsidized LPG program running for now close to 40 years. So while this flagship program of deploying a large number of connections just started a couple of years ago, LPG subsidies has been around in the country for a much longer time, and the idea was to enable constant use of clean fuel in the households. Despite the LPG subsidies, there is a significant chunk of households, low-income households, who say that it is not affordable for them to use LPG, subsidized LPG, for all their cooking energy. And the second reason, which is sort of related to the first one, is the easy availability of free-of-cost biomass. So if, as an economically rational decision, if one has to take as a household head of a rural household, if you have freely available biomass which you can gather nearby your household, or you can prepare dung cakes if you have animals in your cattle shed, And if you do not have a value for your time in terms of the productive use that you can do or sort of earn some real cash, you'll always sort of fall back on easy availability of this free of cost biomass instead of actually spending real cash to procure cooking energy in form of LPG or any other fuel. Having said that, a lot of the households in rural India over the years have started paying real cash for traditional biomass as well. And those are the easiest targets in terms of moving them towards cleaner fuel. Because if you're already paying real cash, real rupee or dollar, to procure your firewood or to even procure dung cakes, which are sold in the rural markets nowadays, it is actually, you're far better off, and households realize this, that you're far better off in terms of the useful energy that you'll get. LPG becomes cheaper than actually procuring biomass in that case. Very quickly on the delivery side, in terms of the availability of the fuel, not just that it has significantly improved. You can see the rural households are not typically getting home delivery of LPG, so you need to actually go to the LPG distributor to fetch your cylinder. But we have seen significant improvement happening over the last few years, but still it is far from 100%. While it is a mandate of the government that the distribution of LPG should be at the doorstep, it is still far from 100% in most of the rural areas in India. And sort of a related metric to it, like how much distance a household has to travel to actually get their LPG cylinder. The one-way distance also has come down, which means that more rural distributorships have opened up over the last few years, but it still remains quite significant. You have to travel as much as 7 kilometers in a state like Madhya Pradesh, and these are the median values. So there are households which are traveling more than this as well to procure your LPG cylinder. And what does this mean? It means that if you do not have a bike or a motorbike or another mode of transport, you're probably using a bicycle, or you're probably renting another vehicle to actually go and grab your LPG cylinder, which sometimes means losing your half a day wage or losing significant amount of time even if you are doing, let's say, farming or something else. So just to recap, what are the key messages? About a fourth of the rural households in these 6 states have moved out of absolute electricity poverty, but still only about 20% are in the top 2 tiers, so a lot more needs to be done. The big challenges are in terms of improving the service delivery, both in terms of maintenance as well as quality issues, but also improving the revenue collection in these areas, because without that, the service delivery is not going to be improved in a sustainable manner. On the cooking energy side, about a third of the households have gained cooking energy access, clean cooking energy access for the very first time in their lifetimes, but only about 6% are in the top tier, so a lot more needs to happen even on this front, particularly on the affordability side of LPG, because that remains the biggest challenge. Affordability leads to stacking of fuel, and you're not able to realize the health benefits that one can accrue from this. This is by and large what I wanted to cover, but I have only covered one aspect of the end users, which is the households themselves. Energy access is not limited to households. Energy access also means energy for schools, energy for health centers, energy for income generating activities, because all that is what's going to lead to the overall socio-economic development. We typically see different researchers quoting different things. There was an Economist article a couple of months ago that electricity access is probably overhyped, it doesn't lead to economic development. But all this doesn't happen automatically. I mean, there are different aspects of electricity, but then there are different aspects in terms of how you translate that electricity access or that energy access towards development. And those links are equally important. That's where I will stop. Thank you. Looking forward to the
Thank you very much, Abhishek, for an interesting presentation. I'm going to abuse my prerogative as the chair and ask the first question, which is, on the LPG side, what do you think should be the government's objective? Should the goal be to get households to stop using firewood at all, or should it be to continue improving the access? What should really be the objective if you think of, for example, the next government after the general elections in May? What should they aim for?
Sure. I think the objective needs to be a cleaner stack at the household level. I mean, what we certainly are not going to see is that every household using only LPG as the only cooking solution for perpetual time. what is more important is that we eradicate the exposure towards harmful indoor air pollution, which is coming from the traditional biomass. Now that can happen by, let's say, coinciding LPG along with electricity, or LPG along with biogas, or even figuring out ways in which we can burn the traditional biomass in a manner which doesn't lead to exposure towards harmful indoor air pollution. The challenge with some of the technologies like improved cook stoves, which had long been advocated as a solution to improve the emissions as well as efficiency of cooking, is that they do not reduce the exposure to the level which is safe for human health. So while they marginally improve the situation, they're not able to improve the situation radically. And I think it's a nightmare in terms of thermodynamics if you look at like the combustion chamber that you need to design, where a household can put anything and everything. I mean, we are expecting a cook stove to behave equally well, whether you put dung cakes, whether you put twigs, whether you put firewood, whether you put pellets. There is no combustion chamber in the world as of today. Physics have not yet reached that level where you can just burn anything as efficiently, especially when the moisture levels are different and so on and so forth. So I think the big challenge is how do we figure out that we abate those exposure towards indoor air pollution. However we can do that. I don't think that we should be putting all our eggs into one basket and just promoting LPG as the only solution to. So we should be more focusing on a cleaner stack rather than one particular clean solution.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to now open it to the audience, and just a reminder, if you are on live stream, hashtag ISEP events, you can ask questions to me, but let's hear from the audience. What are your questions, comments on this?
Sure, I'll go first. I got a couple of questions. The first one is pretty short. Do you guys produce LPG domestically, or you guys import?
Okay, so directly and indirectly, we import about 45% to 50% of our LPG. What do I mean by directly or indirectly? So we import LPG directly as well as a fuel, direct gaseous fuel. But India imports about 80% of its crude oil. So we have a lot of refinery capacity in India. So where we refine the crude oil into different distillates. And as part of that, LPG comes out as one of the distillate. But even after that, we have to import raw LPG from overseas. So directly and indirectly, we are importing about 50% of our LPG.
Okay.
Yeah.
And second question is, I'm kind of interested in how you look at demand from the electricity side. Because it was interesting when you showed the correlation between how long you have the LPG connection versus like the consumption of it. Do you think you would see something like that as like a tier moving out from like 0, 1, 3, 4, whatever, 1, 2, 3, 4, that as long as you start seeing your duration increases, your quality increases, and what else? It's affordability increases. People would start to consume more, but at what rate, right? That's where it's interesting.
Yeah.
Because as you were saying that the demand forecast is kind of low at a disco level, right? But to me, it seems like this is like the case of you build it and they will come, but will anybody invest to build it to ensure that consumption will be there?
Yeah. I think that's a very, very good question. And we as researchers often struggle with it because it's very difficult to do sort of controlled experiments to see how that evolution is happening and what are the factors which are leading to evolution in demand. But sort of before giving a more pointed answer, I just want to contextualize that India, just like on many other things, even on the electricity access front, remains a sort of land of conundrums. At one end, we say that we are an electricity surplus country. That's what India has been touting for the last couple of years. At the other end, we have a lot of households not receiving adequate supply, or a lot of end users not receiving adequate supply. So it's a case of surplus electricity while curtailing your demand, right? So in fact, we have not realized the true demand yet because we have not provided a supply glut. We have a supply constraint all the time, and in that scenario, we are trying to estimate our demands. So even the demand forecast that the discos today do is all based on the historic consumption, which in itself is a resultant of curtailed supply. Are you able to follow?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a pretty tricky situation, and as researchers, we have tried to actually think about, like, can we do sort of controlled experiments, like recruit a community, provide them with electricity access, and track them over time, like and provide them with supply glut. There should not be any supply constraint, and then see how the demand is evolving over time. I guess Johannes might be willing to add something here from the SPI study. Would you like
Yes,
to add
absolutely.
something? Yeah?
We did a study with Smart Power India just last year, pretty much in parallel with Access 2018, where we looked at electricity demand in both for households and for small firms in these villages. And our finding was, first of all, that overall demand is indeed very low. Even if you consider all the options, diesel, mini grids, everything, you aggregate it, and it's something like 300, 400 kilowatt hours a year. So that's 1/3 of India's average, and a very, very low number, lots of lighting and so on. The second thing that we found that I think is relevant here is that a lot of that demand was driven by a very small number of super users. So in a typical village, you might have one user who has some kind of a shop with freezers or some machinery that is consuming as much as everybody else put together, which is quite a striking statistics. And the third one, the good news is that you do see this association where the quality of supply is quite strongly correlated with the use of electricity. So this goes to the curtailment part, where if you are able to provide reliable supply for 16 to 24 hours a day, you start seeing a response to that. Yes, Bryce.
Thanks for a really interesting presentation. It's almost exciting again to be reminded of just how ambitious this exercise is and was. I was a little puzzled to see the two-tier frameworks next to each other. I mean, when I look at the electricity access tier, the framework itself, it's very quantitative with fairly strict thresholds for moving across tiers, right? 5 days, 4 hours, and so on. When I'm looking at the cooking tier, it's very subjective.
Yeah.
Is the household satisfied with availability? Are they happy with the quality of the materials? And I wonder, what kind of limitations emerged in the field as you were doing these surveys about having that kind of question posed to households about their access to cooking energy. For example, I can imagine a household that is actually tier 0, using the most traditional stoves, the most traditional fuels, expressing satisfaction with the availability of their energy.
Yeah, so that's why, so again, a very good question. I'm starting with the very last bit that you said, and then we'll come back to the rest of the question. So that's why different dimensions actually help. Like, let's say the household is super satisfied with the availability of traditional biomass. So it will be probably in tier 3 for the availability. But at the same time, it is in tier 0 on the health and safety front. And the overall tier that the household will get will be what? Tier 0. Right? So it remains, in that sense, it does capture, I think, all the dimensions pretty neatly. But the reason why we had to move to a subjective measurement vis-a-vis an objective one, in electricity, characteristics are still a lot more predictable. Whereas in cooking, the situation is so much driven through the local socioeconomic context and local socio-cultural context that quality of cooking cannot be defined in an objective manner, because there are just so many different types of dishes different areas are cooking. In some regions you have flat bread, in other regions you have rice as the predominant thing. Within bread you have different varieties, there are rotlas, there are chapatis, there are different things happening. So it becomes very difficult to objectively define, okay, what is the objective measure of the quality of cooking. Some of the other measures, for example, availability, we thought, like, can we do it as like amount of time that you're spending to gather your biomass? Can that be used as a practice? But we realized that it is not just about the time. Sometimes, let's say you are spending maybe 3 hours, but you're going into an area which is a lot more danger prone than another person who's going for 4 hours in another geography, but is a pretty safe area. So should it be just about the time, or should you factor in factors like, okay, this is dangerous because of different things? It can be the natural issues with regards to, let's say, wildlife population, or it can be sometimes, this reminds me of a issue in Sudan near the refugee zones, where actually gathering biomass for cooking has led to rape for women because of the very sensitive environment in which they are. So it's also very difficult that shall we reduce all that aspect of availability just to the hours spent, or should we consider these other things? And there are just very limited objective measures to capture some of these things. So yeah, but it's a constant debate we internally also keep having. How should we evolve?
Couple of questions. Was the expansion due to the expansion of the large grid or microgrids?
Large grid.
Large grid.
Yeah.
And direct current hasn't shown up anywhere there, or has it?
No, in large grids, it's only in the transmission, high voltage transmission, where we are using some of the HVDC now. Some of the new transmission lines in India are moving towards HVDC. But in distribution, no. I mean, there are just a couple of small pilots going on here and there, but nothing major.
And are microgrids not really playing much role here, or are they?
Not as much, and in my understanding that the role that the microgrids will play in Africa is going to be far more significant and stronger than the role they will play in India in particular, and also South Asia in general. And the reason being because of the historic investment that we have put into the grid. It's sort of a sunk investment now. Now, whether one chooses to use it or not, that investment has been made. So it's better that we use that infrastructure in a more adequate manner and utilize it. So in that sense, I mean, even though many would argue that if we had to take the decision around electrification 10-15 years ago, and if the technology back then around solar or storage had matured as much, probably we would not have seen as much investments going into the grid infrastructure. But because now we have made those sunk investments, those sunk costs probably should be, it's better that we utilize it rather than abandoning it. Yeah.
Wonderful. We still have time if there are any other questions from the audience.
I have a quick one, maybe. You mentioned the different impacts that transitions in cooking can have on women in particular in certain areas. And I'm curious if you captured that in your massive data set that you collected.
Yeah, so we had a few questions which sort of tried to look into the gender dynamics within the households. So one interesting aspect of this program, the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, PMUY program, which has rolled out 70 million connections, is that all these connections are given in the name of the woman head of the household. So and the another associated aspect of this program, which is in general to the LPG program of the country, that the LPG is subsidized, but it is not available as a subsidized commodity in the market. So in the market, you still procure it at a market price. Then the subsidy comes to your bank account, which is linked to your LPG account. So, so the subsidy also comes into the name of the woman member of the household, her account. But when we ask like who is taking the decision around refills for LPG in the household, still 2/3 of the household, it is the male member of the household who is taking the decision when to order a refill. So even though the program tries to improve the agency of the woman in the household, but given the patriarchal nature of the society, and you see variations across the states. West Bengal has a much larger proportion of the households where women are making the decision around refills, but in most of the other states, it is the male member of the household who are making the decisions around when to order a refill. So gender dynamics does play a significant role, even to ensure that there is sustained use. For example, if you are doing awareness campaigns, typically the government awareness campaigns will target the woman of the household. But essentially, one needs to target the male member of the households to change the decision making, to actually see more and more cash flow getting prioritized towards clean cooking than other expenditures in the household. So yeah.
Did you have one more question? Yes.
Yeah, it's a comment. First of all, congratulations, Abhishek. This is a great presentation. I just wanted to mention, I don't know if you had mentioned this because I came in late, the business about giving up the subsidy. Did you mention that?
Yeah, I haven't touched on that.
Okay,
Yes.
I'll just say it.
Sure.
So one of the things that Prime Minister Modi did is that because the LPG subsidy was given without means testing, everybody had it. So there were huge campaigns saying, please give up your subsidy. Step forward, signal yourself, give it up so that I can light a flame in a poor woman's kitchen. So we all did that. We proudly stepped forward and gave up the subsidy. So that's something that is still very much, it's an interesting feature because he has created buy-in by people who've actively contributed to this. So there's a kind of collective ownership of the Ujjwala scheme. And the second thing I want to mention is that I completely agree with what you just said now, because when I was about 5 years or 6 years before this, before the work that you did now, we were working in Bihar with the Jivika scheme.
Yeah.
And we found out that really, as you said, it's the men who make the decision. And our approach, this is when I was with the World Bank, the approach was we should actually talk about the health benefits to the men and tell them in terms of avoided health costs and avoided trouble. Like if you don't want your women to get asthma and coughing and children to get eye problems and respiratory disease and whatever, then please get them clean cooking. That time none of the Modi schemes were in place.
Yeah.
We were just telling them to do this, but they just felt it was too expensive. They were like, women's time is useless anyway, so if they can go and get this for free, I could have like a bottle of whiskey for that money that would toddy, yeah, whatever, a local country liquor for the money that she would spend on the cylinder. So this is, I think, in terms of a policy prescription for your findings now, I think, and this government would be more receptive to putting in, like, they're good at awareness building. They should really target the men and do what we had designed at that time, but we never got any traction with the then government.
Like just a small addition, like what we are also trying to do is, since you mentioned about Jivika, so Jivika is basically a state rural livelihood mission. It focuses on providing income-generating opportunities to particularly women, but also to the main members, but particularly women through the self-help group sort of movement. And what we are trying to do is that like there are two ways to make a particular thing affordable. Either you keep on subsidizing it, or you improve the purchasing capacity of the household, the income of the household. So what we are trying to now do, and this is linked to the women agency and the gender dynamics within the households, we're trying to see if the cooking energy interventions can be coincidented with livelihood interventions. So you co-intervene the two activities together. Because typically what happens is when you transition from traditional biomass to a cleaner solution like LPG, you end up saving a lot of time. Women are saving time on 3 or 4 fronts. You're not collecting the firewood, that itself is a time saved. You're not preparing the stove in terms of chopping the firewood and so on. Your cooking time itself comes down from 2.5 hours to maybe 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And you also save time in terms of cleaning utensils, because there is a lot of soot which gets deposited when you are doing traditional biomass-based cooking. So all that time saved, which can be anywhere between 2 hours to 4 hours, depending upon where you are in the country, if can be used towards income-generating activities, women would start valuing their time, men would start valuing women's time, and women will earn that additional income, which will potentially can pay for the use of the clean cooking fuel, and also can improve the agency of the woman in the household towards a larger say in that decision. So this is something which we are right now proposing to Jivika in Bihar, along with Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, to see if we can do a pilot around co-intervening these activities. Yeah, okay, now there are 2, 3 questions.
Okay, so let's say if we can take the questions, but let's keep them short and we'll just take them together and we'll give the final word to Abhishek. Yes.
Just build on the gentleman's question about microgrid. I'm kind of surprised you said that it won't play a big role, because I thought that there's a scheme to replace all these like irrigation pumps with solar pump. And I thought that that was going to try to electrify some of the villages as well.
No,
But no.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's just the pumps.
I see.
Let's take the... Oh, well, okay, so
we can talk.
yeah, so we'll have plenty of time to discuss the reception, but let's take one more question.
I have some observations, actually. I run the energy storage program at the Office of Electricity at the Department of Energy. And many of the metrics you're using are exactly what we are addressing, but on a different level, of course.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, we are talking about minutes and so on. For example, I was the first person who asked the question, what do outages cost the US? and it turns out a huge amount. And you know, the way to take the metrics into economics eventually is very important.
Yeah.
Second observation is I'm supporting a company, a technology, who are actually doing an experiment in India of supplying energy storage units to a reasonably large number of households and doing questionnaires and so on of, you know, how do you use it, how useful is it, and so on. I wonder whether it would be useful for you to know more about that.
Yeah, I think
and
this
connect
sounds
to
pretty
it in
interesting.
some way.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah.
And the third observation is about microgrids, because through the applications of decentralized renewable energy, microgrids are almost becoming a necessity. And not just in the US, but for example in Australia. And the concept is almost to replace the entire grid by a set of nested microgrids of various sizes. So the idea of considering your grid as stranded investment, you know, may become a dead alley eventually. You know, it's you're stuck with something because you don't want to give it up. But it turns out that in many parts of the world, Europe, US, Australia, there is a distinct move away from that, if you wish, energiewende, what have you, towards microgrids and towards decentralization.
Yeah, I mean, if I may just
Yes, please.
sort of quickly react to the last point, I think. I don't think there is any two views that decentralization of the energy system is bound to happen. There is more and more decentralized renewables coming in, there are electric vehicles coming in, which along with them also bring a lot of storage, which is very decentralized, and also mobile, which is not the typical characteristic of storage, right? So decentralization is bound to happen, certainly. And that essentially need a very new kind of electricity market structure as well. You're not going to see the existing market structure accommodating all these new technologies in an efficient manner. We are only doing incremental changes to the existing system right now to just accommodate some of these decentralized renewables or some of this storage, but it's not actually exploiting the economic value of different aspects that each of these things bring in. But I do not necessarily see microgrids as a sort of necessity along with decentralization. I think it's probably also just the jargon, but decentralization will happen. You will have a lot more local management happening, and the grid will play a role of connecting a lot of those decentralized solutions to each other. Even in energiewende case, it is on the same grid that they have sort of on top of it, you have vision happening. They're not necessarily calling it microgrid, but yes, a lot of decentralization coming in, both from the generation, storage, as well as consumer demand management perspective, which will play a role. But do we necessarily see more microgrids appearing? I'm not sure. I think it's...
They don't have to be isolated, they can be grid connected.
Grid connected, yeah. So then it's basically grid.
Exactly. I mean, one doesn't have to be, you know, glom onto microgrids as a...
yeah,
you know,
that's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's probably
yeah.
more about jargon. Yeah.
but innovative solutions.
Yes, yes, sure.
Right, wonderful. Thanks so much, Abhishek, for a great talk. Let's give a big hand to joining us. And for those of you who are physically present, this is Washington, D.C., so obviously we cannot have a talk without the reception. Room 202, we have some small appetizers and drinks available. For anybody live stream, thanks for joining us, and look forward to seeing you here next time.